Friday after Ash Wednesday. Dear brethren, in Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 and 15, we see Jesus' response to a question about fasting by comparing his presence to that of a bridegroom and suggesting that fasting will be appropriate when he is taken away. The bridegroom analogy which Jesus uses, the analogy is to explain why his disciples do not fast while he is with them, just as it would be inappropriate for a wedding guest to fast while the bridegroom is with them. It is not fitting for Jesus' disciples to fast when he is present. The analogy of Jesus as bridegroom has a root in the Old Testament. We see in the book of Isaiah chapter 62 verse 5 and book of prophet Hosea chapter 2 verses 19 and 20. God is depicted as a bridegroom rejoicing over his bride, symbolizing the covenantal relationship between God and his people. It highlights the significance of Jesus' presence among his disciples. During his earthly ministry, they are to celebrate and rejoice in his company rather than engage in acts of solemnity like fasting. Jesus' presence brings a sense of spiritual fulfillment. His presence gives us the sense of joy that supersedes the need for fasting. His presence, which his disciples experience, is a richness of fellowship and communion with the Son of God. The disciples also carry a broader implications for understanding the nature of spiritual practices and the significance of Jesus' presence in the lives of the believers throughout the history. In the Old Testament, we see the presence of God was often symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant or the manifested in the tabernacle or temple. That's what we see in the book of Exodus chapter 25 verse 22 and book of 1 Kings chapter 8 verses 10 and 11. Just as Jesus' presence among his disciples is central in the New Testament, so too was the presence of God among the Israelites central to their faith. In his earthly ministry, Jesus, the Son of God, took on human flesh and dwelt among humanity. This is we see in book of Gospel of St. John chapter 1 verse 14. My dear brothers, his presence among his disciples signifies the tangible manifestation of God's love and grace in human history. The same way we see how Jesus responds. The disciples would fast after the bridegroom is taken away. Fasting was a common practice among the Israelites, often associated with the repentance, mourning, and seeking God's guidance. This we see in book of Joel, chapter 2, verses 12 to 13. Again, we see in the book of Ezra, chapter 8, verses 21 to 23. Jesus' response represents a theological shift in understanding of spiritual practices, such as fasting. While fasting had been a significant aspect of Jewish religious life, Jesus indicates that its observance should be contextualized by his presence. My dear brothers, his ministry inaugurates a new era in which the focus shifts from ritualistic observance to personal relationship with him as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. The Old Testament also recognizes the seasons of both celebration and mourning. For instance, festivals like Passover and Sukkot were time of joy and feasting, while occasions like the Day of Atonement were times of fasting and repentance. This we see in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. Jesus' response indicate a shift in the understanding of spiritual practices in light of his presence. He implies that there will be a time when he will be taken away from his disciples, during which fasting will be appropriate for them. This foreshadows his death and a subsequent absence from the disciples. Jesus hints at the reality of his impending departure and encourages his disciples to cherish the time that they have with him, while also preparing themselves for the challenges they will face in his absence. My dear brethren, there is a time for fasting and the time for feasting. Jesus' response highlights the importance of discerning the appropriate spiritual practices for which seasons and circumstances in life. These verses invites us to reflect on our relationship with Jesus and how we respond to his presence in our life. Are we actually celebrating and rejoicing in his presence, or are we distracted by the practices that may not be fitting for the current season of our spiritual journey? Let us reflect and proceed.